like to thank the library for having me here today. But just as important, all of you who are interested enough to show up to talk about the bizarre history of lumberjacks, legends, and lore in the Midwest. So with that, let's begin. My name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, I've spent the last 25 years traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from roadside attractions and weird oddities, UFOs, odd people, mysterious places, you name it. If it's just a little weird and offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of it. But it seems like I was destined to, at some point, explore lumberjack legends and lore. I was born in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and due to all of the lumber mills that we had throughout our city, Eau Claire was known as Sawdust City. We had a lot of lumber mills and a lot of lumber barons in the area. As a young child, I remember taking school field trips down to the Paul Bunyan Logging Camp Museum in Carson Park, where we learned about the history of logging, not only in our own town, but throughout the Midwest. When I went to college, I decided to go to UW Stout in Menominee, Wisconsin, which was formed by James Huff Stout, a lumber baron and owner of the Knapp Stout Company. So it seems like it was a good fit for lumberjacks, legends, and lore. And that's what we're going to explore in this program. For the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a look at some of the weirdest and most fascinating folklore that lumberjack era has to offer. So let's set the scene. The lumberjack era, in its heyday, really consisted of the Northwoods from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan. And the heyday of logging is what we're going to look at today, really the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. Now, of course, there's still logging today, but nowhere near the tens of thousands of people that would go up into the logging camps all winter long. And it was in the winter when all the logging was done. And this was done for several reasons. First, you had no mosquitoes that plagued the Northwoods. No ticks. These were all gone for the winter. But more importantly, it allowed your horses and your team of oxen to slide the logs on the roads of ice and snow down to the rivers. When the spring snow melt raised the rivers high enough, they could then put the logs in the river and ship them down to the nearby mills at all the river towns throughout the entire Midwest. Another reason it was done in the winter is many of the lumberjacks were farmers. They would farm all season and then go into the Northwoods for a few months to earn more income for their families. The lumber camps themselves were made up of numerous buildings. One was the lodging. This was known as the Bunk House. This was the spot where, outside of working, this is where lumberjacks spent most of their time. They'd all be set in there almost like dorm rooms, but a large capacity where people would get a little bunk or a cubby hole. Usually, back then, the only opening was the door and where the chimney went out. So you can imagine several dozen men all lying together in a bunkhouse after a day of work, putting their wet socks and clothing everywhere, spitting tobacco, smoking their pipes, the lice, the fleas. It was not a fun place to be. But this is also where they would come back at night after work and spin yarns and tell tales that we get to enjoy to this very day. Perhaps the most important place was that of the cook shanty. This is where the lumberjacks went to eat. And that's all they did was eat. At most camps, lumberjacks were not allowed to talk during their meals, because if you were talking, that meant you were not eating, and you had to eat as many calories as you could for the grueling day that was about to come. And that also was evidenced by the importance of the cook. Many people would follow the lumber camp, not by who paid the most or who had the best work conditions, but by who had the best cook. That's how important food was to these lumberjacks. And a sample would be food. You'd have oatmeal or cornmeal, flapjacks or hot cakes, salted pork, fried potatoes, tons of coffee or dishwater, swamp water, donuts. And the reason they provide so many pastries and donuts is that it was cheap to make them, and they were high in both calories and fat. Here's a sample cooked meal from 1917 talking about breakfast having cornmeal, apple butter, all the way down to mush and syrup, molasses cookies, you name it. They had all kinds of food, and they would gobble it up because they needed it for the work. And the work was brutal. 6 days a week. The only day off was a Sunday. And that was the day when you were expected to mend your clothing and your work tools. If you were brave enough to weather a bath every Sunday or every other Sunday, that would be a refreshing change as well. Sunday was also the only day when visitors were allowed at the camps. Usually these were wealthy people coming to see the owners and the foreman, the camp boss, because most others could not afford to come see their loved ones in the camp. And while they were at the camp, they would work from what they called can't see to can't see. It would be dark by the time they got in their woods still in the morning, and it would be dark when they came out of the woods at night. In fact, they would often rouse up the lumberjacks by telling them, daylight in the swamp, get out of your bunks, get to the cook shanty, and start eating. And these workers were fueled by two main things, coffee and tobacco, which they had endless amounts of both. But the lumberjack industry was really ahead of its time. It offered equal pay for equal work. No matter who you were, where you came from, your religion, or your skin color, if you did the work, you got paid the same as the next guy. That's why there were so many Native American lumberjacks, African American lumberjacks, and many of the lumber camps were filled with immigrants freshly coming over from the old countries. In fact, there were so many people of different cultures in the bunk house. It was said on any given night, you could hear snoring in 9 different languages. And we often think of lumberjacks as looking like this, the strong, sturdy, big, muscular men. But in fact, keep in mind that the average height of an American male in 1909 was only 5 feet 6 inches. Most of the lumberjacks would have been about 5'2" to 5'4", weighing somewhere around 135 pounds. But even though they weren't large men, they were extremely hard workers, and they prided themselves on that hard work. Even though there was no pay difference, rival people within the same lumber camp would fight with each other and compete to see who could cut the most feet of log, even though there was no incentive except pride to do so. In fact, if you were not a hard worker and you ended up at one of these camps, you wouldn't be there very long, as they would kick you out pretty quickly. And they had their own clothes there as well, like they did with the tools. Most important thing was to have stagged pants. And these were pants that the bottom were cut off, because that was what was most likely to get wet in the snow. And having wet pants that would freeze into sheets of ice was not something you wanted. So they would cut their pants up toward the boot and have high waters. They also wanted clothing that would both keep them warm, dry, and it would be durable. but they didn't have a lot of options. Usually the camp store would have 1 or 2 selections, and that's what you got. Hopefully it was in your size. Much different than today's world, where we get everything we want and have thousands of variations and choices. They simply were at the mercy of whatever the camp store stocked. But all of them would have their turkey or knapsack. This was a bag they'd have packed in case they had to get their week's pay and travel to another camp. Or if they had had enough of the back-breaking work and they simply took off that same day, they would have their turkey packed on for the road. Most of the camps used horses to help draw the sleighs and do the manual work. They didn't like the horses as much because horses needed specific food and a lot of maintenance and maintaining and caring for them. Whereas the ox, that was a different story. They would eat practically anything and you could leave them on their own. Many times they simply did leave them on their own. They would leave them out to be on their own for the summer months and just come back in the fall and winter and gather them back up. One legend is that if you left your ox out over the season, that when you came back they would have turned into hodags, which we'll get to the hodag a little bit later. But like everyone else of that time period, lumberjacks were extremely superstitious about many things, including the buildings themselves. If they walked into a room, the flooring would have to run parallel with them, going straight with them. If they walked into a room and saw that it was going opposite of them, of the room, they would not enter. They thought it was bad luck. The only way you could divert this bad luck is if you entered the room backwards, therefore allowing you to go in. It was also very important to enter and exit the same door, so you would not take the luck with you or bring bad luck with you when you left. They also hated poplar wood, which was a version of cottonwood, aspen, and balsam. I don't know why, but they all hated to work or use poplar. They also believed in a creature called the snow snake. And unlike other snakes, this was only out during the winter. It was white and it's made its way over here from Siberia. And it was a frozen snake, and it hibernated all summer long and came out in the winter. And if you were bit by the snake, you would die if you were not treated. But you wouldn't die from venom and poisoning. You would die from freezing to death because the snow snake's bite was said to turn you to ice. The only thing that would help, the only cure of a snake bite from a snow snake, was a shot of whiskey to help you along, which is luckily that a lot of the lumberjacks were fond of whiskey. They also had a terribly weird belief about wet clothing. As you can imagine, especially in the spring, when the icy cold waters of melted snow and ice are coming down, you're working along the river, you're going to get drenched. But instead of changing out of their wet clothes, they believed that doing that would give them pneumonia. In fact, they preferred to just let their clothes dry on them. They also were superstitious to bunny rabbits, believing that it was bad luck if you did not say hello or say something nice when you saw a rabbit or a bunny moving about. "Have a nice day, bunny," was something many of them would say. Now, I don't know if this legend also expanded to the jackalopes out on the prairies of South Dakota and the West, but the jackalope didn't make its way to the Midwest as much as they said it did out on the western prairies. They also talked about these mysterious balls of light, these will-o'-the-wisps that move throughout the woods. They blamed it on swamp gas because these lights would appear, disappear, and then reappear somewhere within the community in a matter of moments. And it was one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous jobs you could have in America. Every year, dozens of lumberjacks died they either drowned, they were crushed by trees, and there were nameless or countless accidents where people lost limbs and were maimed. And usually if you were out in the middle of the woods cutting and you got a cut or a small injury, they would simply put a plug of tobacco in it and tape it up until you got back to the mess hall or to the bunk house. It was really bad. The doctor or someone on duty would sew you up instead of going to the hospital. And when people did die, there wasn't a big fuss about it. Usually, a lot of these lumberjacks were simply buried where they died. Whether they were put in two pieces of bark, if they were very lucky, they'd be buried in a barrel. But many of them simply were just buried where they lost their lives. Many of them who lost their lives along the river were buried as the group made its way down river. One thing they would often do is put the boots on a tree of any person that drowned or died, any lumberjack. So if you're out hiking through the woods and you see a pair of boots strung up to a tree, there might be a grave underneath those boots. And perhaps the most infamous lumberjack of all time was that of Paul Bunyan. Everyone is familiar with Paul's story. Keep in mind, Minnesota claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before they get too excited, so do the states of Wisconsin, Maine, Michigan, Vermont, and even the country of Canada claim to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. What we do know is that the first oral tales of Paul Bunyan seem to have originated from a camp north of Tomahawk, Wisconsin during the winter of 1885 or 1886. Sometime around that era is when the first tales of Paul Bunyan began in Tomahawk. It wasn't until many years later that the first story in print appeared in the Duluth News Tribune on August 4th, 1904. So Minnesota can claim the first written accounts of Paul Bunyan, but Wisconsin claims the first oral accounts of Paul Bunyan. And Paul Bunyan was a little bit different during those days, because Paul Bunyan looked more like this back then. Again, he looked like some sort of wild man, some prehistoric throwback to humanity. That's the way he was portrayed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then they softened him up a little bit and gave him more of this look, used mainly for advertising on a lot of wood and lumber companies throughout the United States. Quite a bit different than how we see Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox today. But Paul's story is a fascinating story. Of course, he was born of gigantic proportions, and he had a humongous appetite. In fact, it is said that they constructed a skillet so large that people would tie strips of bacon to their feet and skate around using it, or butter, to get the pan ready, the frying pan ready for all the flapjacks to feed Paul and the men. Of course, Paul is known to be with Babe the Blue Ox. A lot of people don't realize the origin of Babe and how he became friends with Paul. Because Paul found Babe in the winter of the blue snow. It was so cold that people started cursing up a blue streak, and that turned all the snow cold. It was the winter of 2 winters on record. A terrible winter. It was so cold that winter. What's that? How cold was it? It was so cold that winter that fish grew fur to keep warm. It was so cold that winter. How cold was it? It was so cold that words froze in the air at night. You had to wait until sunrise the next morning for the words to thaw out, and you could hear what your friend was talking about. That's when Paul was found Babe in the snow, blue from the cold. So he brought him in, and like everything around Paul Bunyan, Babe grew to an enormous size. And he lived with Paul his entire life, even when Babe got married. Babe was a male and married Bessie the Yeller Cow and lived a happy life with Paul Bunyan. In fact, Paul and Babe are responsible for the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota. Their footprints made the lakes all over the state. If you don't believe me and think I'm spinning a yarn, how do you explain Lake Bemidji in Minnesota, which is in the shape of Paul Bunyan's footstep as he made his way through the Midwest? Paul was an avid outdoorsman, loved to hunt and fish. In fact, he was such a good shot with his shotgun that he could hit birds and ducks flying so high in the sky that by the time they were shot and fell to the ground, the meat was already spoiled. That's how high up they were flying. One of my favorite stories talks about how smart Paul Bunyan was. And he was plagued by all of the mosquitoes of the Midwest. So Paul wanted to get rid of them. He had heard about giant bees being down in Texas, gigantic proportions. So he sent one of his most trusted men down to grab the bees, to bring them up, to fight the mosquitoes and get rid of them. We know this is a true story because we have this drawing of one of his men bringing these giant bees up from Texas to fight the mosquitoes. But even though Paul was very intelligent, his plan backfired because the bees didn't kill the mosquitoes. They mated with them. And then you had a creature that had a stinger on both the front and back. These creatures were responsible for many deaths of lumberjacks over the years. Thankfully, most people believe that these creatures are almost extinct, that there's not many of them left, so you don't have to worry about them carrying you off with their two stingers. And Paul had a lot of friends. He wasn't alone in his lumber expeditions. One of his friends was his dog, Sport the Reversible Dog. Paul actually saw Sport as a young pup, freshly born. Paul mistakenly thought it was a rat, so he threw his hatchet at the dog and cut him in half. And when he went over and saw it wasn't a rat, he realized his mistake. He quickly grabbed his sewing needle and thread and sewed the dog back together. But in his haste, he sewed the dog opposite way, where the body was upside down. But this turned out to be a very good thing for Paul Bunyan, because Sport, the Reversible Dog, then became the best tracking dog in the United States, because Sport would run on its front legs until it got tired chasing a prey. Then it would simply flip over and run on the other legs, making it possible to track down any hunting animal they chose. Paul also had his accountant, Johnny Inkslinger. He was using so much oil that you can see barrels of ink that just by not crossing the T's and I's in 1 week, he saved 12 barrels. It was said that Johnny Inkslinger used a split pencil so he could charge people twice when they came into the store to buy something, charge twice to their wages. But those who knew Johnny Inkslinger said that was nothing more than bunk shanty talk, where the word bunk comes from. Not true. That Johnny Inkslinger was a reputable and credible accountant working for Paul that never cheated anyone out of their earnings. And Paul didn't have a lot of time to take care of Babe the Blue Ox. That fell on a man called Brimstone Bill. He was the only one wild enough to take care of Babe the Blue Ox. In fact, Brimstone Bill was said to be one of the best swearers of all time. It was said that he could swear for 45 minutes straight and never repeat the same word. And as you can imagine, dealing with Babe the Blue Ox, that might come in quite handy. Paul's axe has become a competition between the Wisconsin and Minnesota University football teams. It began in 1948 after the first trophy, a slab of bacon, went missing when the Wisconsin Badgers failed to turn it over. And the axe goes back and forth from the Gophers to the Badgers. In about 130 meetings, they're pretty much split right down the line with 50-50 in their wins. But like all good things, the death of Paul and Babe came. And it was thought that Paul died in Minnesota. In Kelleher, Minnesota, they have Paul Bunyan's gravesite that you can go and see where he's buried. But not so quick. People in Wisconsin, in Wausau, think Paul is buried up on Rib Mountain and Babe the Blue Ox on a nearby hill. But I disagree with all of it. I think the idea that Paul and Babe could ever die is one of the biggest yarns ever spun. One of the biggest tall tales in folklore. Because Paul and Babe will never die. They will continue on as long as people go into the woods. As long as people take cabin adventures. Paul and Babe will still be roaming the north woods of the Midwest, searching for that next 40 acres of land to start logging. One of my favorite things about lumberjacks is all of the weird and unique creatures that they believed in. Perhaps the most infamous creature is that of the hodag. As you saw earlier, ox that were left out would often turn into hodags. So what exactly is a hodag? Well, if you believe the legends, the hodag looks something like this. A long creature with horns and spikes and long claws and teeth waiting for prey. Well, the hodag was made up by Eugene Shepard in 1893. He was a timber cruiser in the Rhinelander area. He was a great teller of tall tales. In fact, many believe that Eugene Shepard was responsible for the Paul Bunyan legend. And he may have been. If he wasn't, he was one of the earliest tellers of Paul Bunyan legends. But he said he was out in the woods cruising for timber when all of a sudden he saw one of these hodag-like creatures. So he came back to town, gathered up a posse, a group of men looking to capture this, and they did. They captured one of these creatures where Eugene Shepard said he brought it on display to nearby carnivals and circuses and county fairs where people would pay to go see it. When he was done there, he brought it to his home in Rhinelander, dug a big pit for it, and charged people to come see it. Once they found out that it was his children in the pit maneuvering the mechanical beast, more people showed up to see how he had done it than before when they thought it was real. And there are hodags all over the Northwest. You can go and get your picture taken with a lot of these creatures. Some people are afraid of these monsters, but you don't have to worry. It was said that these things would only eat white bulldogs on Sundays. Some believe that the hodag is now extinct. And the reason for that belief is that we have a lot more white bulldogs today than we did in the past because the hodag is not here to eat any of them. Eugene Shepard also admitted that it was a hoax, but he said he hoaxed it because he had actually seen one out in the woods, but he was unable to capture it. It was so ferocious, he had to hoax it. They also believed in one of my favorite creatures, the hoop snake. A snake that could bite its own tail, making itself into a hoop, and it could chase you. It could chase you with gigantic movement on its own wheel. But there were two ways you could escape the hoop snake. One was to jump through the hoop while it was chasing you. That would confuse the snake so much that it would lose concentration and fall over. The other way to get away from a hoop snake was simply to run uphill where it could not follow you. They also had the axe handle hound. This was a dog-like creature, the head shaped like the axe blade, and his body was the axe handle. Again, you didn't have to worry about this thing attacking you because it only ate axe handles throughout the lumber camp. Anytime somebody misplaced their axe handle, they blamed it on the axe handle hound eating it, and that it was gone, they'd have to replace it. Weird creature is up next. This creature, the hoogag, looks like a camel, except that it has long nose and a long lips, and its legs lock, so it cannot bend at the knees, meaning it has to sleep upright. And you can hear it walking through the woods almost as though it's marching, crashing through brush and making a ton of noise. And being that it could not lie down to sleep, it'd have to lean up against trees at night to sleep. So all the noises of the trees crashing and limbs breaking at night inside the bunkhouse, that was blamed on this creature knocking over the trees. They also had the agro-pelter, a monkey-like creature that would sit up in abandoned trees waiting for unsuspecting lumberjacks to come by, when it then would crack them over the head with a log, thus killing them. Sometimes it would rip lumberjacks' arms off and hit the lumberjack with their own arm. Many lumberjacks were said to have gone missing by these crazed killers of the woods. Also, imagine at night you're in the bunkhouse when you hear wood cracking and the sounds of trees splitting. Well, obviously that's not just the wind and the weather, it's the Splinter Cat. The Splinter Cat was a large panther or puma-like creature that would get a running start and smash into a tree and splinter it, and then it would eat all of the splinters. Unfortunately, many lumberjacks met their end when the Splinter Cat mistakenly took them for a tree and smashed into them and killed them. This next creature you might hear about, you might hear it in the woods, but most likely you'll never get a chance to see it because it is a hide behind. And just as the name applies, it would hide behind trees, sneaking up on lumberjacks. It was said that if you stood there and immediately turned around at 180 degrees, that the hide behind would still be behind you. No matter what you did, you could not get it in front of you. And it would simply wait, hiding behind things, for unsuspecting lumberjacks to come by. It would snatch them, and they'd never be seen or heard from again. But living with the lumberjacks was a weird way of life for many animals, including the side hill gouger. These creatures lived on the hills of where the lumberjacks on the mysterious pyramid 40 acres, and they lived on the side so long that they began growing one set of legs longer than the other, so that they could only walk one way on the hill. If they tried turning around, they would fall over. So all you'd have to do is turn the other way to get away from these creatures, because they spend so much time on the hill, they were odd shapen. Also had to worry about the roperite. Now, these creatures were more out west than in the Midwest, out there with the other mysterious prairie creatures, the jackalopes, and many others. These look like this creature, look almost like a Dr. Frankenstein creation of many parts of other animals. But the most telling part of this thing was it used its long nose or beak-like for a rope, and it would grab people, rope them in, take them back to its lair, and then devour them with its claws and its sharp teeth. Luckily for those of us today, a lot of these creatures are thought to be extinct. But maybe they're not. That's up to you to discover on your own. Go into the Northwoods, into the forest, and you have to wonder if that snapping of a twig, was that a deer? Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more mysterious. And a lot of people claim that the lumber era is gone and that it's forgotten. And the lumber era is gone. The day when tens of thousands of men would leave for all winter long, basically going to a winter camp with thousands of other men where they would work all winter long and then come back and use the money for their farming, or many would use it for all of the lumber towns, drinking, gambling, and maybe some of the ladies of the night that worked in those establishments. So the era is gone. The idea of men going into the woods, cutting down the forest, will never return to the scale it once was. It was also during this time where we collected these stories, because at night, the only thing people would do is play music on weekends, their instruments, or they would tell tall tales sitting by the fire. And the tales that they told, they weren't told in the same manner I spun yarns today. It wasn't a long, complete story. It would be somebody would tell a story about Paul Bunyan, and then later someone would jump in and say, no, you have it wrong. This is what really happened. Or they'd try to one-up one another. But what we do know is that most of the lumberjack legends and lore were lost, especially the Paul Bunyan stories, because when people went to collect them in the early days and they listened in on the lumberjacks telling these stories, they found many of them were sexist, crude, and racist jokes about Paul Bunyan. They couldn't print them, and many of them were boasting about sexual activity, so they couldn't print them without being obscene or being fined. So a lot of the original tales about Paul Bunyan have been lost to history. But again, I think this is a bunch of bunk. I think that the stories of lumberjacks will continue on forever. As long as people still go to their cabin in the woods, as long as people vacation in the gigantic woods of America, these lumberjack stories will continue on forever. So next time you're in the Northwoods, keep an eye out for all these wonderful and amazing lumberjack legends and lore. And if you want more information, my website has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I really hope your adventure doesn't end at this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of the Midwest, and I think you'll discover that lumberjack history is still alive, along with so many more oddities and weirdness. So again, I'd like to finally thank the library for having me here. They put a lot of effort into getting me here. I cannot recall a time in American history where the library has served such a purpose as it does today. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is that fabric that keeps the community together. It's a real treasure for any community that has one. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of them. But either way, they should be applauded for getting me here. And to show my appreciation, if you want to get any of my books, go to my website, chadlewisresearch.com, type in the coupon code LIBRARY, and save 15% off any or all of my books. And with that, thank you all for coming, and keep an eye out